Hello, welcome to Sunday Profile. I'm Richard Aedy. Today, the doctor trying to stop children from getting cancer. Glenn Marshall is that rare thing in medical circles. He's a clinician researcher, which means he's both a hands-on physician, working with patients and their families, and a scientist, leading a team in the laboratory. Specifically, he's director of the Cancer Centre at Sydney's Children's Hospital and head of Translational Research and Molecular Carcinogenesis at the Children's Cancer Institute Australia. These are both demanding roles. They require different ways of thinking, and normally you'd need two different people to fill them. But Glenn Marshall makes them complement each other, and translational research, after all, means translating the findings of basic research into medical practice. He doesn't do this alone, far from it. He leads teams. In both the hospital and the laboratory, the work is collaborative. And the efforts of the research team, it's been announced this week, may have come up with a discovery with enormous implications for childhood cancers. We'll get to that later. First, I wanted to know how much progress has already been made.
In Australia today, there's over 600 children diagnosed with cancer each year, and sadly still, however, around about 1 in 4 of those children are not going to survive. And so you're right in saying that the cure rates from childhood cancer have gone from 10% in the 1950s to 75% in the current day, and that is a real modern medical miracle. But we've got so much further to go. I get out of bed every morning expecting every one of my patients to survive, and so until we get to 100%, we certainly won't stop in our research.
I imagine that when you tell children and their parents that this is the diagnosis, this is what's happening, that those figures are a part of your armoury, that there's real reason for hope.
Yeah, I think one of the mantras that always sticks in my head from long ago that a parent said to me is, she said, look, I expect the worst, but I'm hoping for the best. And, what I say to parents, look, this is a potentially fatal disease. I want you to file that away in the back of your mind. We won't talk about it in the near term now. And this is how we're going to go forward. And, I'm hopefully going to be invited to your son or daughter's 21st birthday. So, I think that's a more optimistic and positive way to paint things.
I suppose the next part of the conversation is about treatment, what happens next. Is that the tough bit? Because the treatments are, they are extremely demanding, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I mean, if you look across the range of chemotherapeutic agents that we use, they're all patented more than 30 years ago, which is extraordinary. We're just now seeing personalised medicine, in other words, targeted drug therapy coming in, and that will really change the face of what we do. But the problem with the old drugs is that it's a great blunderbuss approach. And so in a growing child, there's a lot of normal tissues that are part of the growing child that are damaged by the chemotherapy. And this increases both the short-term acute side effects, so the kids spend a lot of time in hospital, and then there's a significant late effect of treatment as well. So if I look around our ward in any day, I'm not seeing children with cancer, I see children who've got the side effects of the treatment of cancer.
And are children particularly susceptible? Because chemo drugs are designed to target cells that are rapidly dividing.
Correct.
That would fit a tumour in a grown-up.
Yeah.
But in a child, of course, they're growing, so they're going to get smashed.
Yeah. They do, and yet, there is an intrinsic resilience, and so there is a margin of benefit, if you like, in terms of the anti-cancer effect between the effects on the normal cells and the effects on the cancer cells that means that we can eradicate it in the majority of children. But you're right in saying if you look at the 9 big children's hospitals around the country in Australia, roughly a quarter of the business every day in those hospitals is actually taken up with cancer care.
Why do we still have these old drugs that were first invented 30 years ago?
Well, they worked, and that's probably the most important thing. A lot of those drugs actually don't work in many types of adult cancer. So we've hung on to them. We've also, as children's cancer specialists, gotten better in the way in which we use them. And I think you would also have to say that childhood cancer is a very rare disease when compared to many adult types of cancer. And so it's actually been difficult, if really impossible, for pharmaceutical industry to actually come up with a reason to be investigating causes and treatment treatment of childhood cancer. So in many ways, you could say what we do in the research arena, we're advocating for children who actually don't have a voice. We think that what we're doing is, in fact, making up for that gap.
I think childhood cancer is only 1% of all cancer.
Correct.
Cancer is really fundamentally a disease of ageing. As we get older, things go wrong.
That's right.
And you're a researcher as well as a clinician.
That's right, yes.
Apart from being at the Children's Hospital, you also lead this research team at the Sydney Children's Cancer Institute. Just this week, you've published some research which may turn out to be profoundly important.
Yeah, we're very excited about the findings. We decided some years ago to try and understand what the cause of childhood cancer was at its very beginnings. And so more than half of children with cancer have a type of cancer which comes from an embryo cell. Now, when we're forming our heart and liver, etc., in utero, in the womb, we make many more liver-forming cells than we need. And so there's a lot of excess to requirement. And so those cells have really very regulated mechanisms for how they're gotten rid of before birth. And a small number of these cells can persist beyond birth and retain their embryo growth properties and then undergo a transformation to cancer later on. And so what we've tried to do is understand the molecular mechanism which causes that embryo cell to resist the death response around the time of birth and persist. And that's, if you like, the seed or the beginning of precancer that goes on to form embryonal childhood cancer.
And the smoking gun, it seems, is this BMI1 gene.
Yeah, BMI1 it's a very interesting protein in the adult tissues. It's very important to help with renewing stem cells that we have in all of our organs. And what we found is that in these embryo cells that should have died off at birth, there's an excess of this protein, and it is, in addition, damping down one of the cancer barriers we have in all of our cells, known as the P53 stress response. And so we're getting bombarded with, as an adult, cancer-promoting factors, UV light, sunlight, etc., smoke, every day. And we have a number of barriers, if you like, in normal cells, which either cause that cancer-affected cell to die off or to go to sleep, if you like, and stop growing. We found that in these rare embryo cells that persist beyond birth in our animal modelling, that the cells lack appropriate P53 responses, and yet those responses get switched back on in the adult cells.
So what's happening is, you think, this gene BMI1 you found turns off the P53.
Just transiently.
And what the P53 would do is say, look, we've been bombarded with something that may cause us to go cancerous. Obviously, it doesn't really think this through, but that's what the cell does. So the option is to essentially commit suicide as a cell.
Correct, yeah.
And it stops that from happening.
Yes.
So therefore it can then become cancerous.
Exactly. These cells should have died off, and they're not. And part of that reason is because of their absence of the cancer barrier transiently. We're hypothesising that, perhaps around the time of birth, with all the stresses of hypoxia or low oxygen, low serum or nutrients, that it's not a good thing to have your death response being so highly wired, if you like, to be switched on at a very early point. That's a sheer hypothesis, but certainly what we observe is, if you like, a soil in which a cancer-promoting factor in the first year of life then of the child can very quickly cause these persistent embryo cells to cause cancer.
So knowing that it is this gene, or believing it to be this, does that mean you can essentially develop some kind of diagnostic to test for it?
One of the approaches in research that we certainly emphasise is so-called translational research, where you actually constantly thinking about ways of applying what you're finding at the bench to the bedside. And so while we're very interested in pulling apart the detail in a lot more intricacy, I'm more powered by the approach of trying to find a diagnostic test that you could actually predict, perhaps on a blood test, and we are making some progress in that direction, that these embryo cells are persistent in the first place. And then second of all, to devise a drug that you could give that would switch off the BMI1 or alternatively switch back on the P53 gene. And now with our Drug Discovery Centre, we've actually made some progress in that direction.
So you may have something you can effectively whack these cells with to turn on the P53.
Yes.
Would that mean, if you develop it, that there would be no more childhood cancers at all?
Well, I don't know about 100%, but certainly that's the goal of our work. That's what drives us. So some years ago, it occurred to us that, if you could actually nip this process in the bud, so at the point of pre-cancer, switch back on the death signal, and these cells suddenly sort of wake up and realise they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, they just die off. And you might only have to do that once in the early period of the child's life. This, again, is theory still, but supported by some laboratory evidence. And so, if we're successful with this treatment, if you like, or preventive strategies are probably a better way of looking at it. Our hope is that basically I'll be out of a job in, some years after that, which would be a good thing, I think. But one of the big problems is safety testing. You just don't give babies stuff without doing, very carefully designed trials where you've done safety testing. But there are actually precancerous conditions in children. And so the Down syndrome children have a higher risk of leukemia. And many of them actually present with pre-leukemia in the point of within the first couple of weeks after birth. And we're very interested in studying that phenomena a little bit more to go forward with perhaps testing our treatments in those children.
This is Sunday Profile. I'm Richard Aedy, and my guest is one of Australia's leading clinician scientists, Professor Glenn Marshall, who works on childhood cancers. Glenn, if I were to go through all of your titles, we might run out of time. There's a lot you do, and it's all related to cancer. What gets you out of bed in the mornings? Because some days are going to be very tough days.
It's certainly true, Richard. I like to finish a day by, and I used to talk to my son about this, the pluses and minuses, and I always like to lean on hope that I've landed on the plus side, but of course that doesn't always happen. And so a good day is if a patient hasn't relapsed or hasn't died. A good day is if I've been in the lab with some of the young scientists and we've made just that little incremental progress. We've got one result. No one else would understand it. I can't explain it to anyone, but it fills you with great joy and enthusiasm. But I'd have to say at the start of a day, the thing that gets me out of bed is the parents of the children we treat. I mean, it's really inspiring, actually, seeing the way that parents deal with chronic and potentially fatal ill health in their child, the sorts of things they do for them, the sacrifices they make. So for me, really, there's no need for other motivation. That truly is a great thing. And, we work for the kids and their parents.
You said earlier, actually, that kids are incredibly resilient when going through chemo. I suppose that's partly a biological term and partly just how they tough it out. I've heard that they're so brave when facing their own death, braver than many adults are. Do you have any observations about that?
I've been a paediatrician most of my professional life, so I'm not sure I can comment about adults and their approach. All I can say is they do have a strength that helps them and their family. It's a deeply sad time, and I suppose that there's no easy way to really go through such an experience. I was with a family just last week at Bear Cottage Hospice at Manly, and just found it very difficult to go through myself, but it was nothing compared to what the parents had to go through. The child was very strong and helped the strength of that child helped that family.
Crikey, you must come out of that, though, and just need a bit of a moment by yourself.
I certainly do. I've great family, and that's really important. I always say to people entering our profession, make sure everything's good at home, because if it's not, you're going to have a pretty tough life. So I'm very grateful to my wife and son, but I'm really part of a very big team.
You said earlier that, when you're saying to parents and kids, this is the diagnosis, the prognosis is quite good, and, I want to be there at their 21st. Do you find yourself at 21st?
Yeah, I do, actually. Not super often, but, a few times a year I'll get invited to weddings and 21sts and christenings, and that's absolutely wonderful, actually. But I also attend, a lot of sad funerals and times with parents. We have a number of fundraising groups who work with us to community, basically donating money to try and make sure that we continue doing our research. And it's, sad as well as positive with those families to see how they've dealt with their grief.
Yes. Some feel particularly strongly that they want something good to come out of it, that they want a legacy. And I was reading about a lab that's named in honour of one of your former patients, Stephen Walter.
Yeah, Steve was a really inspirational young man I knew for 8 years, and he sadly lost his battle with cancer. His family, his mum particularly, Sue, has held a fundraising event for over 10 years now and raised millions of dollars for cancer research. And Steve's, one of his lasting wishes was that no kid should have to go through what he had to go through. And so it was a great honour, actually, a couple of weeks ago for the Stephen Walter Foundation to say that they wanted to have our lab named after Stephen. He inspired a lot of people, and his family continued to do that on a local and national level.
It seems to me that because you work with children who face the prospect of dying, and most don't, thank God.
Fortunately.
Yes. But this inevitably enmeshes you with their lives, and it's not a kind of temporary arrangement. You'll always be their doctor in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to be invited to the 21st and things, but it's also my duty to see that they get good care as an adult. So if you look at children who've been treated for cancer in New South Wales today, there's about 5,000 young adults who are survivors of child cancer, and about a third of those kids will actually have health problems. And as recently as 2 months ago, I had to sit with a young lady in her 30s who developed a second cancer, a leukemia in her 30s, where I'd treated her in her early teens for her first cancer. And I just feel a great deal of responsibility. I can't care for her because I'm a paediatrician, but to just be with the family, be with her and make sure she gets very good care.
How good are we at that? We seem to have been remarkably successful through efforts of you and people like you with children. But down the track, how good are we at dealing with the consequences of a child surviving cancer?
I think we're not terribly good at it. We're basically doing a lot of research in that area. So one thing's not clear is what the best model of care for these young adults should be. As I said, about a third of them will have a significant health issue. Another third of them will need a little bit of counselling and or preventive health measures. And so we actually run a survivorship clinic, and the great emphasis there is on healthy lifestyle because their major problem is they do have a slightly higher risk of second cancer in their life, and so not cigarette smoking and reducing sunlight exposure, these sorts of things. I think anyone in that space would say we're still learning how to do all that best, but as you can imagine, if you do the numbers over the next sort of 10 years, there's going to be literally tens of thousands of these individuals, and we're not quite sure what they'll have as health issues in their 50s and 60s, and what we can do today to actually prevent that. But
it starts much earlier, doesn't it? And as I understand it, you're not thrilled with the way, and your colleagues too, with the lack of support for kids who have survived cancer, gone back to school after they've had their cancer treatment, in terms of how well looked after they are. Yeah, another major interest of mine is actually gaps in learning for children who've been treated for cancer, but really what I'm about to say could pertain to any child with a chronic illness. And what we find, we commissioned a project about 3 or 4 years ago with the other child cancer centres and Ronald McDonald Charities to try and understand a bit better what the gaps in learning are. And what we find is it's not so much a gap in learning for children with brain injury that's had a brain tumour, for instance, but actually the vast majority of problems are in those kids who've missed a year or 6 months of school, who then go back to school, and there really isn't a sort of process to integrate them, to deal with their missed schooling. And then what happens as a result is that they feel out of place, they fall behind, some develop
develop psychosocial issues, and it wears their family out. So their mother and father are often up at the school many times and trying to advocate for them. So, yes, I think that is a significant issue today. We need to get this on the books with the Education Department and the Health Department, getting them together to work toward improving the learning course for people who've got the normal capacity to learn. They just missed out on a whole lot of learning. So it can be caught up. It's a solvable problem. Just needs resourcing.
Actually, speaking of resourcing, can I ask you about money? Your research team is receiving a very significant grant over 4 years. It's $4.5 million. And of course, you only get that for being successful at what you do. What about the private sector, philanthropists, even ordinary people? How much do they provide?
Well, if you look at what we were talking about earlier about the cure rates being so good in childhood cancer, that's only got there through community donation. So, yes, there has been government support, but by and large in the US, Europe and in Australia, these clinical trials and some of the discovery processes around the clinic have actually only been funded through donated funding. We currently have something like 8 trials managers at a cost of something like $700,000 a year. That's just in our centre, and that's all donated money. And so you can't practice clinical medicine as research without that sort of financial support. So I would say to you, yes, there is a really critical need of the community to stand up and in many ways be part of our team and advocate for children by providing us with this funding. In the private sphere, meaning pharmaceutical companies or other biotechnology companies, there isn't the profit motive there because the disease is relatively rare. So, I guess that's true of many research areas in medicine. So it's very difficult. I don't know that I've got a solution for that.
What I'm interested in is what drew you to the area. I can see that it's enormously challenging and that it could be immensely rewarding. It's tough too. What made you want to do this?
Oh, it was really a combination of opportunity, of mentoring and sort of looking to some of my mentors and seeing what terrific people they were. And at the time, technology had also, and science had got to a point where I could see in the 80s and early 90s that cancer drug development, the understanding of cancer was going to have a really far-reaching effect in the field. I think the other thing is that from my mentors, just the simple act of being a humanist, if you like. That's a sort of very general term, but doing doctoring and thinking scientifically about what you're doing, but also being very strongly sensitive to the humanist aspects of what you're doing. And I saw that in several of the people who were senior to me who started our department, and I worked with Darcy O'Gorman-Hughes and Marcus Fowles, Les White.
So this formed the determination to be a clinician researcher, because people like you are rare. Most people are one or the other.
Yeah. Well, the only way I've continued to be a clinician, firstly, things are going bad in the clinic. I can go into the lab, and usually I haven't had too bad experiences in the one day in both arenas. It's very hard work. So, like most people in this sort of space, you work very long hours and weekends and stuff. But I think that you've just got to keep your eye on where it's all going. So for me, working so hard really is nothing much when compared to what we can achieve.
How do you deal with the away time? You must exercise, you must hug the children, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, the family life is great. My son's sort of, grown up. He's 18 now, so I exercise every day. I do a lot of running and I like riding a surfboard, actually, longboard. That's my passion. So, and then I do a bit of painting as well. I do oil painting. I don't do it for long, just a short period each sort of week, and that's enough actually to keep you away from things.
I'm glad you do.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks very much for your interest, Richard.
Professor Glenn Marshall is a paediatric oncologist and director of the Centre for Children's Cancer and Blood Disorders at the Sydney Children's Hospital. He's also head of the Molecular Carcinogenesis Program, Children's Cancer Institute at the Lowy Cancer Research Centre, University of New South Wales. I could go on, actually, but we really don't have the time. You can find out more about Glenn Marshall, listen to the interview again at our website. That's abc.net.au/Radio National. The program is produced by Belinda Sommer. I'm Richard Aedy.